Hi there. So today we're going to be talking all about practicing. So your progress in this course is going to be dictated by the quality of your practice session. And this section is really designed to give you all of the tools necessary to really accelerate your growth and be the most efficient in getting through the program. So this module is divided into two sections. The first one is called the life cycle of a skill. And in that one we're going to be talking all about the sort of learning curve that you go through when you're exposed to new material. So we talk about the beginning stages of learning a skill, the intermediate stages, and then the long-term retention of learning a skill. And the second part of this module is called the anatomy of a practice session. And in that we talk about exactly what you need to do when you sit down to practice. So let's dive in. So this first section is called the life cycle of a skill. So every time you get a new exercise in this program, you're going to experience a few different stages of developing that skill. And I like to use the analogy of building a rocket ship. So before you build a rocket ship, there is the research and development phase. And that's analogous to when you are learning a new technique, you really need to wrap your head around the entire problem. So you need to learn it, get it into your hands first. The second stage in the life cycle of a skill is what I call building the rocket. So this is the stage where we're building the foundation of the skill and we're polishing it, we're making sure that it's well engineered so that when it comes time to launch it and put it in orbit, it's reliable and we can count on it. And the last stage in learning a skill is what I like to call takeoff and orbit. So at this point, the skill has sort of been mastered, we've got it in our hands, it's ready to take off, we trust that it's well engineered and that we really have the technique down in our hands, and then it goes into orbit where we do spaced repetition to retain the information over a long period of time. So for each of these stages, we have different strategies to help you navigate the challenges of skill acquisition. So let's talk about the first stage of learning. So we call it research and development because our job is really to be curious and open-minded and break down the larger problem into a bunch of smaller problems that we can sort of reason about and get into our hands. So what we do is we take the exercise and we break it into a bunch of smaller pieces. And this is called chunking. So let's say I was just given the exercise of learning the major scale in the second position. So I open it for the first time and it's a lot of notes, it's a lot of new information. I might recognize bits and pieces, but for the most part it's unfamiliar and it's a little bit intimidating. So instead of looking at it as this whole 16-note pattern, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it into a bunch of chunks, and maybe I can think about 3 or 4 notes at a time. So I break it into a bunch of sections of 3 notes, and I just learn the first 3 notes. And then I learn the second 3 notes. And then I tie the first and second 3 notes together and I get a 6-note phrase. And then I learn the next set of 3 notes and I glue that to the larger chunk before it. And then the next set of 3 notes and glue that on. And this doesn't even have to be a linear process. In the example, we started from the beginning, but you can start from the end and move backwards. You can start from the middle, learn a bit of the middle, learn a bit of the beginning, and then learn a bit of the end and glue all 3 pieces together. In the end, our goal is to glue all of the pieces together so that the entire exercise is one single chunk. And in the long run, we want the entire fretboard to really be one giant chunk. So this whole process is made especially simple using the tools that we provide you in this program. So when you get the exercise, you'll be able to open it on your computer, select sections of the exercise, and loop it in the software. You can slow it down, you can speed it up. You'll see real-time playback of both the tablature and the written notation, as well as a visualization of the fretboard itself and where to put your fingers. So that's chunking, and it's a vital part of the research and development process. So once you've got the general shape in your hands and you see it as one chunk, it's time to move on to the next stage in the learning process, which I like to call building the rocket. Now when we build a rocket, we really want to make sure we're spending our time to make sure every aspect of it is well engineered and well understood, so that when we go into orbit, we can rely on it and we know that it has a solid foundation. So we want to approach the guitar in the same way, and we offer a couple of strategies for making that happen. The first one is called the feedback loop, and the second one is called interleaving. So the feedback loop is a tight loop of performing, listening, reflecting, and improving on skills. And we do it a lot of times in a single practice session. So you'll need a few tools to do the feedback loop. The first one is obviously a recording device. We recommend just using your cell phone and a recording app. The second one is a metronome. The third one is something to write with, a pen and paper or a laptop. And the fourth one is a positive mindset. So a lot of students will be tempted to skip the feedback loop, but it is a vital part of polishing a skill and really getting it into your hands, so do not skip this process. Trust me. This is hands down one of the most powerful exercises you can do for your accelerated growth and long-term retention of these skills. So here's how the feedback loop works. We start by turning on the metronome to a comfortable tempo that we can play the exercise without making too many mistakes. And then we turn on the recording device and we record ourselves playing through the exercise. And we want to make sure that the recording is, 30 seconds to a minute long, not too long, because we really want to make sure that the feedback loop is short and tight. After we're done playing the exercise, we stop the recording and we listen with a sort of open, objective, and curious mind. Here we'll be taking notes on the things that we're learning about our playing. So you can listen for things like note accuracy, rhythm accuracy, tone, expression, phrasing, things like that. Now there's something to look out for here, and this is sort of where music practice is a lot like life practice. But we all have a sort of critical voice in our head that will frame some of our performance in a negative way. And we want to look out for that, and we want to prevent ourselves from talking about our playing or taking notes or making criticisms in a negative way. We always want to be framing our notes in a positive and constructive and actionable light. So instead of saying like, measure 3 sounded bad, we want to say, chunk measure 3 and review it to bring it to a higher level of proficiency. Instead of saying, measure 5 sounded bad, we instead want to say something like, introduce more dynamics into measure 5. So we really want to be aware of how much negative self-talk as opposed to positive self-talk we're allowing for ourselves. And wherever we can, we want to remove the inner critic and replace it with the inner coach. Cool, so once we listen back to the recording and we reflect on how it sounds, we're going to make the improvements that we wrote down. So if things need to be reviewed, we'll review them. If parts of our phrasing needs to be improved by more dynamics, we'll remember that and absorb that information. And once we feel like we're ready to try again, we just repeat the whole process. Set up the metronome, record ourselves doing another pass, and review and reflect. And you can do this as many times as you'd like, but I would recommend 3 to 4 times before moving on to the next strategy, which is called interleaving. Daytime. So the next strategy that we offer for building a rocket ship is called interleaving. The idea here is that continued practice on one single practice item for more than 15 to 20 minutes actually has diminishing returns after a certain amount of time. It's actually better if we practice for 15 to 20 minutes and then we put that exercise down and focus our attention on something else. And the reason for that is the brain does a lot of the integrating and processing of this information when we're not focused on the practice item itself. So we allow the brain to have that space away by interleaving that exercise with a few other exercises. And this is part of why your daily lesson plans that we provide you have a few different exercises and review items on them so that you can start the practice session, spend 15 to 20 minutes on one exercise, and then redirect your attention onto some other exercise or review item and give your mind some space to process the information from the original exercise. And what you'll notice is giving the mind some space to really integrate the learnings will actually accelerate your growth in the long run. And you'll encounter this very directly when you're practicing. So you'll practice an item for, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes, you'll put it down, focus on something else. Then when you come back to it, you'll pick up the instrument, you'll play the exercise, and you'll notice that it somehow became more integrated into your hands, and your hands seem to understand it a bit better, and that is exactly the benefit of interleaving. So once you have an exercise up to speed, you could see the whole thing as one chunk, and you've used the feedback loop and interleaving to really polish it, you're ready for the final stage in the life cycle of a skill, which I call takeoff and orbit. So takeoff is the moment that you really have attained some level of mastery of the skill. And you'll know that this has happened when you can sort of execute the skill without thinking too hard. You might have to remember a few bits, but you don't make very many mistakes, and you can execute it pretty effortlessly. That's about takeoff. And once you get to this point, you'll start putting that skill into what I call orbit. And when the skill is in orbit, we use a strategy called spaced repetition. Now, spaced repetition optimizes and takes advantage of a natural phenomenon in the brain called decay. So when you learn a new skill, there's a natural decay rate to that information in your brain, the rate at which the information goes from being known and mastered to forgotten. And what we want to do is catch that information and review it before the information decays from the mind. And that interval between review sessions extends the more we review it. So put into practice, when we master a skill, we need to review it 24 hours later. That's the first decay interval. If we review it, say 48 hours or 72 hours later, the decay rate will have already lapsed and we'll have mostly forgotten the skill and we'll have to bring it back up to mastery again. The next interval is 3 days after that first review period. The next review interval is a week after the 3-day interval. The one after that is a month later, and then we'll review it once again 3 months later. So this process of reviewing at the set interval is called spaced repetition, and we handle a lot of the heavy lifting of spaced repetition for you in this program. So your daily lesson plans will automatically include the material that you need to review at the correct interval. It'll continue to remind you to review items that you've already mastered even after the program has finished. But we really want to make sure that the skills you learn in this program, and especially in this practice module, can be used throughout your entire life of music. So when you're learning skills in the future, be sure to write down the day that you get it to mastery, and maybe implement your own version of spaced repetition so that you can retain the information that you learn for the rest of your life. Okay, so that's the life cycle of a skill. And in summary, there are three main stages to the life cycle of a skill. The first stage of the life cycle of a skill is called research and development. And in that stage, we really remain curious, and we use tools like chunking to break down the larger idea into a bunch of smaller ideas that we can more easily learn. We glue those smaller chunks together until it results in the larger concept. The second stage in the life cycle of a skill is called building a rocket. In building a rocket, we use the two strategies of the feedback loop and interleaving. We use the feedback loop of recording, listening, reflecting, and refining a skill to really polish up the technique and make sure that we build ourselves a solid foundation in the skill. And we use interleaving, the idea of practicing a skill for a set amount of time, 15 to 20 minutes, and then redirecting our focus to something else or taking a break in order to leverage the brain's natural capacity to integrate learnings while we're not focused on the technique itself. And the third stage in the life cycle of a skill is takeoff and orbit. Takeoff is the moment where you really feel like you've mastered the skill, you can execute it pretty effortlessly without thinking too hard. And orbit is when we use the technique called spaced repetition to review the exercise in the correct interval so that we can beat the brain's natural decay rate and retain the information for a long period of time. So now that we've talked about the life cycle of a skill and we really know how to take something from the unknown and bring it into the mastered, we're going to talk about how to structure a practice session so that you can really get the most bang for your buck in your time investment. So this section of the module is called Anatomy of a Practice Session, and we're going to be talking about what actually makes a high quality practice session. How do we set ourselves up for success, and how we utilize our time in the most efficient way possible so that we can make the most gains in our playing over the shortest period of time. So a high quality practice session actually begins before the practice session even starts. And it starts with a very clear plan. Now, as a student in this course, we handle a lot of the planning process for you. Every single morning we give you a custom practice plan so you know exactly what to do when you sit down to practice. But after you finish this course and you're practicing in the future, you need to remember that the quality of a practice session is really dictated by the thoughtfulness of the practice plan. So do put some thought into what it is you want to accomplish in any given practice session before you sit down to practice. Now, the next thing you want to think about in a high quality practice session is having all of the necessary tools at your disposal. So the things that we require for this program are a recording device, that can be a phone app, a tuner, which can also be on your phone, a metronome, also on your phone, and some sort of practice journal. In this program, we also recommend that you use your laptop to open your practice plan so that when you open the individual exercises, you can take full advantage of the interactive nature of the videos. Okay, so now that you have all the necessary tools, you would think that now is the time to really dive into this practice session and sink your teeth into the technique, but not quite. So when you're starting a practice session, you really want to ease yourself into the heavier material. So what we recommend you do is start without the instrument, put the instrument aside, and really start by moving around the room. We also encourage you to do some stretches to prepare our body for the physical activity that we're about to do. And this is a really important part of the process as well, because we're going to be practicing so much in this program that we don't want to incur any overuse injuries or anything that's going to prevent us from making the kind of progress that we want to make. So do make sure that we do these stretches every single time we sit down to practice. Okay, here's a demonstration of some stretches that you can do before your practice session. So the first thing you want to do is stand up and sort of ground into your feet. Maybe do a couple of body scans where you bring your awareness into your feet and slowly scan your awareness up your body through your legs, through your knees, through your thighs, into your hips, into your torso and chest, throat, down your arms, down your forearms, into your hands, and really get full awareness of your body. Maybe spend a couple of minutes just sort of checking in with what's going on with your body. So the first thing you'll do is raise your hands up. Keep your hands nice and relaxed, and then you'll angle them out first, and then you'll angle the hands up. Take a couple of deep breaths, then down, Then put them out, take a couple of breaths. Then angle them in, take a couple of deep breaths. Next, you'll ball them up into fists. Do the same thing, starting with up. And down. Outside. Inside. And every time you're taking a couple of deep breaths with the stretch. So I'll show you a few more stretches that you can do, but make sure you're breathing through each of these exercises. So the next one is hands straight out with your fingers pressed together. Hands up, down, out, and in. Again, breathing 2 or 3 times with each of those stretches. And then hands with your fingers spread, up, down, out, and in. The other thing you can do is clasp your hands together and just make figure 8s. You can also do this with the hands flat, or you can clasp the hands together backwards like this, keeping your forearms together and making that figure 8. The other thing you can do is throughout the day, even when you're not practicing, you can kind of just do lots of wrist circles and make sure that the wrists are staying nice and loose. Okay, there's one more stretch that you can do, and that is if you have some trouble with stretching on the instrument, maybe you have small hands or just trouble stretching between different fingers, you can take a fist and just put it in between your fingers on the left side. The left side's really the culprit here. So we'll just put a fist in there, hold it for a few seconds and take a deep breath. Switch to the next one, then switch to the next one. And do this a few times, and that'll just kind of like loosen up the grip in the left hand and kind of give you more reach. So this part of the sort of like warm-up process is extremely important, and you don't want to skip it because we want to come into our practice session with full body awareness, because playing an instrument is both a cognitive skill and it's an understanding as well as a kinesthetic skill. So we want to go into the practice session with full kinesthetic awareness. So for the body scanning and the stretches, we recommend that you do all of that listening to music that inspires you. Practice sessions can be quite intense because we're focusing on so much technique, but we want to remember why we're doing this, and that's ultimately to create beautiful sound. So we want to start with that level of inspiration. Okay, cool. So now that we've spent a few minutes sort of checking in with the body, warming up, doing some stretches, we're ready to actually sit down with the instrument. So at this point, you'll want to sit down and review your practice plan to get an overview of what you're going to be covering in this practice session. So you'll sit down with your practice plan, and the first thing you'll do is look at the practice plan and see if there are any review items in there. If there are review items, you'll just run through those exercises very quickly, and hopefully they'll still be retained so you'll be able to execute them relatively quickly. You just want to go through and review them for a few minutes, play them in a few different ways, maybe run them through the circle of fourths, and just generally make sure that the technique is still in your hands. The next thing you'll do is look at the list of techniques that you're working on, and these might be brand new techniques that you've never seen before, or techniques that you're still working up to the point of mastery. So you'll sit down with your practice plan, look at the first exercise and open up the video, and then you'll work on that for 15 to 20 minutes using the techniques that we talked about in the life cycle of a skill. And then you'll interleave that exercise with the other exercises that we suggest for you that day. So the technique core of our practice session is really using the strategies that we talked about in the life cycle of a skill to refine the techniques and exercises that we've assigned you for that day. At the end of the practice session, you really want to leave about a 10-minute block of free time, unstructured time, and that's designed to sort of bring our head out of the sort of more cerebral, technical stuff that makes up the core of the practice session and allow you to play more freely. You can use some of the techniques that you learned in this practice session to see if you can generate some new music. You could put on someone else's music and try improvising over the top of it using the techniques that you've learned in that practice session. For instance, if you're working on intervals, say you're working on the thirds, you could put on a piece of music, figure out what the key is, and take a solo using only thirds. And that's a good way to sort of integrate the things that you're learning, take them out of the conceptual and into the practical, and use them in the real world. So that's the anatomy of a high quality practice session. So sort of in review, we start with a really high quality plan, we get all of the necessary tools in order, And then we start by checking in with the body and seeing where we're at. We start with some movement, maybe moving around the room, we do some stretches, and we really check into the kinesthetic senses so that we can bring that to our practice session. Then we start off with the review items, and we review anything that needs to be reviewed in our spaced repetition, and then we move to techniques and use the strategies that we learned in the life cycle of a skill, and then we wrap up the session with some free improvisation and just general play, trying to take the techniques that we learn in the practice session and apply them to a real-world situation. Now, before we wrap up this module, I want to talk about a few other things that are important for this process. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground in this program, and we're going to be covering it quite quickly. And it's very likely that you're going to run into circumstances where you're absorbing new information and it might be frustrating. So it's really important in those times to have a bit of compassion for yourself and understand that this is what the learning process feels like, and it's actually a good thing. And you have lots of tools at your disposal. So if you get frustrated at any point in the program or you're feeling a little bit blocked, please reach out to us, send us a direct message or a video or a question, anything you'd like, and we'd love to unblock you and help you move along in this process more smoothly. The other thing that I will say is that there is a lot of emphasis on technique and proficiency and mastery, but the truth of the matter is all of that is subjective and there is no destination. You're always going to be growing in all of these techniques. Realistically, 3 months is a very short period of time, so while we'll expose you to all of these new concepts and exercises, you may not be able to get all of them to mastery by the end of this program. In fact, it's very unlikely. But understand that this is a lifelong process and that you'll have many, many years to polish up all of these techniques. So while you're going through the program, it's in your best interest to allow yourself some leeway in the definition of what mastery is. And that might be, okay, I can play through this comfortably and make fewer than, let's say, 3 mistakes. That might be a good time to put that skill into orbit so that we can progress through the program at a reasonable rate. If we become too perfectionist about getting the exercises perfectly right, we won't actually make the strides that we're hoping to make. Alright, so this has been the module in practice, and just to review, we started off talking about the life cycle of a skill. We talked about the skill as having 3 main stages. We talked about the research and development phase, where we're staying curious and we're using a strategy called chunking to break down a concept into smaller pieces that we can think about and learn, gluing those pieces back together so that we understand the whole concept. Then we moved on to the building the rocket phase, where we talked about the feedback loop and interleaving, 2 strategies that are going to help us polish up a skill. Then we talked about takeoff and orbit, where we use something called spaced repetition to retain a skill over a longer period of time. In the second half of this module, we talked about the structure of a practice session, where we talked about how to begin a practice session with a strong plan and all the necessary tools. We then check in with the body and start with some stretching and really get ourselves warmed up for a high-quality practice session. And then we move into the review elements of our practice plan and sort of get ourselves warmed up with things that we already know. Then we're moving into the heart of the practice session, which is where we focus on the new techniques and things we're working on. And we use all of the strategies from the life cycle of a skill to really craft these strategies and absorb the new information in the most efficient way possible. Then we wrap up the practice session with some free improvisation, and we use some of these skills in a more practical setting. In the last section of this module, we talked about mindset things, and I encouraged you to reach out to us if you ever encounter any trouble or frustration in the process so that we can unblock you and help you move through the program more efficiently. So thanks so much for watching this module in practice. I hope that it helps you optimize your practice sessions so that you can get the most benefit out of the time that you spend in the practice room. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you so much again for signing up for this course. I'm so glad that you decided to make the investment in your musical path. I'm really excited to watch you grow.